Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 269th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today, our panel will discuss voting, why we vote, how we choose to vote, for who we choose to vote for, and we consider party, race, religion, other issues. Today's panel begins with Mike Reese of Howard Hanna Real Estate, then Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services, followed by Patty Haskins, retired math teacher at Wadsworth Senior High School. Mike, you got the topic. Why do people vote? Who do they vote for?
That's $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah,
There's a lot
especially
of
for you.
there's a lot of reasons people vote. They're either supporting their candidate or they're voting against, somebody they don't want to be in. Maybe something, a candidate has some views that they agree with or disagree with. I mean, there's a million reasons that we could go through why people choose to vote. I guess the thing I would like to understand more than why people vote is why people don't vote. We live in a place where your voice can be heard. You can, and some of these city races are very close, especially, one or two votes may really matter. So, kind of that's the thing that I would like to figure out is why people don't choose to use their voice that they have to get out there and, make a difference one way or the other. Um, there's been believe it or not, I was looking at some of the data for presidential elections, the last two in 2020 and 2024, and we had among the highest voter turnout for both those elections in the last 100 years, which is, it's fairly impressive until you look at, you're still in like the 60% of eligible voters. So you still have a very large percentage of people that are able to vote that still are sitting at home or not taking advantage of making their voice heard, like I said before. In 2020, 66% of eligible voters voted, and in 2024, 64%. And those are high numbers as far as voting in America is concerned, but still, it's a far cry from everybody. Also, I wanted to touch on what's been in the mail or in the news recently is mail-in voting. It's been under attack. It gets under attack every one now and then, but President Trump has recently, been attacking mail-in voting. So that's another issue that, I think something like a third of all Americans voted that way in the last presidential election, which is a really big number. And there's been some, people saying that there's a lot of fraud involved in mail-in voting, but I think that personally, I think it's very important that we continue it because it does give people that have a hard time getting to the polls to get out and vote and let their voice be heard. Currently, for what I've looked up is there are 34 countries that allow mailing voting right now, including some of the big ones: Canada, UK, Australia, Germany. Those are some of the ones that allow it. As far as fraud is concerned, there's been several studies by Brennan Center for Justice, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Center for Election Innovation and Research all have discovered that there's very little, if any, fraud with mail-in voted. Votes are usually checked against signatures and also put before a bipartisan panel. So I think that argument doesn't really hold water, and that's a good way for people to get out and vote. That was implemented during the Civil War originally in this country. So soldiers that were out would be able to vote, while they're out in the field, and because a very large percentage of people were out there. Um, Later in the late 1800s, it was expanded more for civilians. Kansas had was one of the first to expand it, and the reason they did it was allow railroad workers to vote. People that can't get to the polls, and I think that that's still an important thing today. You have a lot of people that are elderly that have trouble getting around. You have people that live in very rural areas. Um, Another issue that I think this helps, that this one that's not talked about very often is, there are places where there's just a lot of people and not enough polling locations. There was and I don't remember the numbers. I remember hearing about this and not the in the 2020 election. They had a polling station in Georgia that had, 50,000 people living in this area in one polling station. So, you're subject to, 7, 8 hour lines to vote, which is
Why
absolutely
does
insane.
why does that happen?
Well, the reason they believe is because they had, a majority of one party that was trying to limit people from voting. This is kind
And
of
they
voter
control how many
suppression in
polling places.
disguise. So, you take away the polling place, these people just can't vote, so
Yeah.
it's a form of voter suppression, but sneakily, this helps with
Brian,
that though, because you can easily mail in a ballot, and
Brian,
still
you
make your voice
spend a lot
heard.
of time in polling places, working as a volunteer. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts?
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Yes.
All you, Brian.
Thank you. Mike has brought up some very, very good points, and especially in local elections, I can think of several elections that it was decided by 1 or 2 votes, and every vote counts, and that message needs to get sent out loud and clear. I know I can only speak for the experience I've had over the years. Patty can speak to her experience. I feel very confident in Medina County that every vote that's cast, every legitimate vote that's cast is counted. We have a very robust board of elections. The representation from both parties is there. We have good board of election workers. I think I would push back a little bit on the suppression thing. It's hard to find poll workers. We're constantly trying to find people that were willing to volunteer to get the training. It's a 2 or 3 hours training, and then to work the whole day at the polls. And it starts usually, you have to be there about 5:30 because the polls open early, and it goes till usually done about 9:30. You get breaks throughout the day, but it's very hard to find people. And I would think that if in a county or an area that has low participation when it comes to manning a poll, they have to cut back somewhere. They have to consolidate somewhere. And sometimes people might end up, standing in line for several hours to vote. But it's important to vote. The apathy that surrounds voting, I think, takes place when people begin to think that their vote really doesn't count. That, it's just one vote. It doesn't make any difference statistically if I vote or not. It's going to happen, why even bother? But your vote does count, and it's so important to have, especially in local and state elections. Getting people out there to vote for particular issues. There are issues that people show up for. Usually school issues. When it comes to levies, people show up for levies. Usually there's some issues on the ballot when it comes to local issues. The changes that take place that have to go before the voting public usually get people to turn out for those. But and the excitement around a presidential election really brings people out to the polls. I want to dampen down this conspiracy notion that somehow mail-in voting is just fraught with fraud and all that kind of stuff. You can absentee vote in the state of Ohio, and I'll tell you, I can only speak for what they go through at our board of elections. They scrutinize those absentee ballots. They go through and make sure that ballot and that person is actually that person. We have provisional voting. Maybe Patty can talk about provisional voting. When someone comes up to your polling place and you can't find them on the books, you get a chance to vote. It's just provisional. And then the Board of Elections goes through, like, say, for instance, someone shows up and they don't have a photo ID. And I think that's one thing we need to really point out, is that a photo ID is simple to get. You know, I think you can get an ID card for what, $8 or something like that. And I've never had anybody in my experience show up and make a stink about having to show a photo ID. Most people have a driver's license. That works too. It can be a military ID card, you know, you name it. And so the person shows up and they're not supposed to vote at your polling location, but let's say the lady's got 3 kids. They're hanging on her. She's frustrated. She's been to the Masonic Lodge. They turned her away. She comes to another point and she ends up at yours. She votes provisional. And they take a look at that. Let's say she didn't have an ID. She has, I think, 3 days to go to the Board of Elections to provide her ID, and it's done. So there's the perceived barriers to vote, as far as I'm concerned, just aren't there. If you want to vote, you can vote. It takes a little effort on your part, but your vote counts. We just have to work on the apathy that some people have, that their vote doesn't count, it doesn't make any difference, and it does. I can tell you that in Medina County, if you vote, it's going to get counted. And we go through a variety of procedures and processes. It's very fair, and it's audited. And, you know, this notion that somehow absentee ballots, and they like to throw in, you know, mail-in ballots, that's absentee ballots. I mean, that's what they're talking about. It works. It works in the state of Ohio. It works in our county. And I'd encourage everybody to vote.
Yeah, well, Patty, you've been on both sides of the equation many times. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, you had talked about, you know, why people vote. As Mike had said, you know, the percentage of people that vote in this country actually is very low when compared to other countries. You have countries where 98% of the population, eligible population, votes. And here in the United States, it's low. Unfortunately, the only time it's even remotely high is during a presidential election every 4 years. We have, for example, in Wadsworth, a local election coming up in November. Mike is on the ballot. And unfortunately, turnout at local elections is extremely low, unless there happens to be a school board issue on there, which is going to cost people money. People simply don't turn out for the election. And I find that incredible, because what is going to affect us in our personal everyday lives is more impacted by the local officials than it is by federal officials. Yet we seem, as a populace, to show less interest in those local issues and in the people that are going to be representing you in your local city, town, township, or county. You know, if you walk around Wadsworth and ask people to name the council members that are, I would bet 1 in 10 maybe know it. And that might be wishful thinking. There are people that don't know who the mayor is. No offense. And Robin has been mayor for how many years now?
18 years.
18 years. And there are people that can't tell you who the mayor is. Now, this lack of interest in this subject has always amazed me. I think we all need to be concerned about who is running our government, whether it be federal, state, or local. You know, that's extremely important. You talk about, you know, the way or the reason people then might vote, what would bring them out, and who they vote for. Well, some people get turned out just simply because of a particular candidate. And for example, when John Kennedy ran for office, he received votes, a lot of votes, simply because he was Catholic. Now, there were those that voted against him because he was Catholic, but there had never been a Catholic president. And coming from a Catholic family, I remember his elections, and no one in my family would have dared not vote for him simply because you were electing a Catholic. So you have that type of impetus. People vote perhaps on the issue of race, whether the person is white or black or Asian or whatever the case may be. They decide that they're going to vote for a person and get out to vote because they want to vote for that person of that particular ethnicity, or perhaps because they're totally against people of that ethnicity becoming a member of the vote.
Wouldn't that be a good case for a voter just to stay home?
I think so, personally. I don't think that you vote for a person just because they happen to be a certain race, color, or creed. I think you have to look at the issues and the person as a whole. Unfortunately, that's not what's going to happen. And I'd like them to look at the entire candidate and the entire issue. There are people that simply vote or go out to vote because there's an issue on the ballot that's of importance to them. Anything to do, for example, with gun control, anything to do with abortion, issues such as gerrymandering. Ohio had that issue on the ballot recently, and unfortunately it was on the ballot, passed overwhelmingly, and our dear state legislature has chosen to totally ignore what the voice of the people was. But people go out to vote for those things. Some people simply just don't take the time or don't take the interest in voting and how it's going to impact them. And that's unfortunate. Now, once we get to the polls and we have voting, I think, as Bryan said, I think that our system in Ohio is excellent. There are present calls, though, from federal level to do away with, as was already discussed, mail-in ballots, also to get rid of the machines because they're supposedly not going to give a true rigged, right? And the interesting thing is, just this week, Dominion finally received payment for the lawsuit. Again, who was it against? I can't even remember who it was against. They received a huge amount of money in a settlement because those people declared that the machines were rigged and they couldn't work. Now, having been a poll worker, when we had machines and when we didn't have machines, I can tell you for a fact that it is much more accurate now than it ever was. And when you're trying to, as Bryan said, it's hard to get poll workers. It is a very, very long day that you have to work. And, you might be on your feet for a lot of the times. It's very difficult. When we got machines, it made closing up at the end of the day so much simpler, number one. Also, I think it's more accurate. Very honestly, I trust that machine to count me more than I would myself.
Okay, well, while you're recovering, I have a question for all of you. What do you say to the person that says voting is actually illogical? One person goes out and they have one vote. Nobody's ever heard of an election that was decided by one vote. Therefore, it's not logical. Pardon me?
I can tell you one that was.
Okay, one.
It happens. There's been several in our local community that by 1 or 2 votes, the person won. And that's what people need to get out of their head, is that, well, it doesn't make any difference if I don't vote. It does make a difference, especially on a local issue. Local issues, there have been several times in Wadsworth where people have lost elections by one vote. By one vote. And that's what people don't understand. They think, well, yeah, I'm just going to stay home. It doesn't make any difference. You know, the yada, yada, yada. It does. It is a privilege to vote. I mean, if you don't think it's important to vote, you know, I always get a laugh out of the vote, out of when they have elections in Russia. You know, 99.5% of our people voted, and they all voted for one guy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You know?
But you talk about a rigged election.
Yeah. So
Well, you know, and the funny thing is, this move by Trump, you know, reinforcing this mail-in ballots came right after he spoke with Putin, and he said, well, Putin told me that mail-in votes are corrupt. Now, no matter what you think of the president, anyone that takes voting advice from Vladimir Putin has a problem.
Well, I think North Korea has quite a system. They get a lot of participation. So if you don't vote, you don't eat.
Oh, wow. I remember I lived in Columbus in 1960, and the year that Kennedy was elected. And at the time, I was an active Catholic, and I went to Mass at St. Aloysius Church on Broad Street. And the priest giving a sermon actually said that it would be a sin for you not to vote for John Kennedy. I think maybe that was the last time I listened to a priest for voting advice.
You know,
there were, in fact, excuse me just a moment, in Cleveland, I think it was the first election when Obama ran, there were actually precincts that voted 100%. And there are others that voted like 99 and 98% for Obama. Anyway, it just, some things can distort the daylights out of an election. That's one of them.
It happens.
Yeah. Well, if you get, you know, the line of thinking like, oh, my vote doesn't count. Now, what happens if you get, 10 people that think that and don't show up, or 100 or 1,000, And there's a lot. I think that's the problem is, one person can make a difference, but 1,000 people make a huge difference. So if you got to get rid of that thinking, it's just not a good way to think, because if you think that way and other people think like that, it's like.
In past national elections, in the recent ones, there have been some states that were extremely close elections that were, it went both ways. And yes, it was like 3,000 votes, but that was out of 20 million votes. And that's really scary that it's that close. And, and my big thing too is some of those people that don't vote are the ones that show up at protests on both sides and complain.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain.
Right. 100%.
Do you know that for a fact, Patty?
Pardon me?
Do you know that for a fact? The people that don't vote are the ones that show up to protest?
Oh, there are some, yes.
Or they're paid. You heard about that, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're having a hard time finding paid protesters now.
Well, I recently saw a gentleman on TV. It was on Fox, and he was he owns a company that they are paid to provide protesters. Yeah. And he does it for both sides. I mean, you might think that this is a Democratic thing. No, it's both sides that do this.
Yeah.
He's just an enterprising individual.
Yeah. Especially down in DC when you got to get a crowd up of 200 or 300 people, you look at all the signs. If they're saying it's an organic protest, why do they all have the same signs? Why do they all have the same shirts? Why do they, there wasn't anything organic about it. They just didn't show up. They're pretty much paid. They provide them with the T-shirts and the posters and the sayings and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just think, there has to be a better way of getting the message out that it really does, your vote really counts. And I go back to that picture, and I can't remember who ran it, but that when they had elections the first time in many years, I think it was in Iraq, where the lady had the purple dye on her thumb. That's how they determined that you had
Very
already
proud of
voted.
I
Where was
did-
it? Do you remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, she was quite proud of it. That
She was proud that
didn't want to wash her hands.
yeah, that ink wasn't going to come off for 2 or 3 days, and she was showing everybody that she had voted. That lady took her life in her hands when she voted, and we just don't get it. You know, and for some reason we just don't get that it's such a privilege to elect and have home rule in essence. You know, to be proud of your vote. You know, we give them a little sticker when they walk out that I voted, but you know, we have to do a better job of encouraging people to vote, and you know, just tampering down this notion that somehow the machines are rigged. You know, the experience of shutting and opening one of those machines is like you have to have nuclear codes. I mean,
Right.
I mean, it's crazy.
Amazing.
It is amazing the process you go through, and it's all bipartisan. You know, I just can't walk over to the machine and do anything to it. I have to have someone of the other party go with me, and they have rovers, the people that go around and from the Board of Elections, and they
Opening and closing of the polls.
Oh,
one of your jobs is in the morning start open machines, in the evening close them.
closing
And
machine,
it has to be a Democrat and a Republican
right?
doing it together,
Together, yeah,
just
together,
to avoid any conflict.
yeah. And the
And-
shutdown, the ballot counter, the DS200 or whatever you call it, the one that you put your ballot in and it counts. Yeah, I mean, it's like serious nuclear codes. I mean, you follow step by step by step. And yeah, I would say if anybody has a problem with somehow their vote is being shanghaied on the internet, it's laughable.
Okay, Brian and Patty, both of you are so active on both sides of the equation. Well, Brian, at least by osmosis. I think a member of your family has run for office a few times. If you had any advice that you can give to Mike, what would it be?
Go to everything you possibly can. FaceTime, get your social media campaign going. More and more people look at social media. You know, you can basically blast out those types of things. Go to things, have people, you know, have a very simple platform that people can understand. You know, forget the manifestos. You know, of everything what you're going to do. Focus on 3 or 4 things.
Patty, what do you have to say to Mike?
I agree with Brian. You need, it's the visibility, and people have to know your name. I know when I ran, people were saying, well, signs aren't important. Personally, I think signs are one of the most important things you can do, because and Brian, I'm sure would admit to this. We used to get people coming to vote who had no clue who was on the ballot.
Yeah.
They didn't know one name from another. Nothing. They just went in and, you know, picked the number. But if they recognize that name, or they see your name every day driving to work,
Yeah,
and every day driving home, they're going to go into that ballot box and go, oh, I recognize that name.
I think I'll vote for him because I recognize the.
I agree
sorry,
with that
that's one of the
100%.
reasons.
100%.
it reinforces. Signs
Okay.
reinforce your message. You know.
Unfortunately, we're over time.
Oh, sorry.
No, perfectly all right. So we'll have to sign off. We can continue this discussion afterwards. But we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.